Good morning, club members. We digest world-class journalism and talk it through in plain English. Here are 5 stories worth your time. The owner of British Airways has cancelled its plans to grow flight capacity this year. Soaring jet fuel prices caused by the conflict in Iran forced the airline group to freeze expansion. Just 3 months ago, the group planned to expand its total flights by 3%. Now, executives expect total capacity for the year to stay completely flat. People still want to travel, and flight demand remains strong across most international routes. Yet, filling planes with passengers is no longer enough to protect corporate profits. During the first 6 months of the year, pre-tax profits fell by 19%. Earnings dropped to €1.4 billion, despite total revenues rising slightly. Higher fuel expenses wiped out most of the money gained from steady ticket sales. The airline group expects its annual fuel bill to reach over €8 billion. That total is more than €1 billion higher than what the company spent last year. Military strikes in the Middle East disrupted oil tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz. That vital shipping passage carries a huge portion of the crude oil used for aviation fuel. When oil supplies get disrupted, the price of refined jet fuel spikes almost immediately. Airlines must pay these higher prices to keep their fleets flying scheduled routes. To cushion the blow, many carriers have already raised business-class ticket fares. They are trying to recover extra costs without scaring away leisure travellers on tighter budgets. Earlier this year, some European airlines even cut short-haul fares to encourage hesitant holidaymakers. However, long-haul flights cannot easily absorb expensive fuel without charging passengers more money. The chief executive insists that long-term travel demand remains very reliable. Even during periods of global uncertainty, people still prioritize spending money on holidays. Yet running empty or half-filled aircraft during expensive months is a risk no airline wants. By freezing growth now, British Airways avoids adding extra flights that might not make money. The strategy focuses on protecting cash reserves while fuel markets stay volatile and unpredictable. Airlines across Europe are now preparing their schedules for a potentially difficult winter season. If jet fuel prices remain high, more carriers may be forced to trim winter flight schedules. For travellers, this means fewer flight options and likely higher prices for winter getaways. The big test will be whether passenger demand stays strong as ticket prices continue rising. Moving on to our second story, we turn from rising airline costs to Wall Street. A 24-year-old tech researcher has just lost control of his giant hedge fund. His name is Leopold Aschenbrenner, and his investment firm was called Situational Awareness. Before starting this business, he had zero practical experience in buying or selling stocks. He previously worked for a philanthropic foundation tied to the collapsed crypto exchange FTX. Later, he joined an artificial intelligence research team before leaving after a dispute over leaked information. 2 years ago, he published a long paper predicting massive social changes from new technology. That famous paper caught the attention of prominent Silicon Valley investors like Peter Thiel. With their financial backing, Aschenbrenner quickly raised billions of dollars for his new fund. His strategy was straightforward, focusing almost entirely on bold bets in artificial intelligence. Whenever he revealed a new stock position, eager market traders pushed the prices even higher. By the middle of this year, the fund reported gains of over 400%. Total assets managed by his young team briefly topped $20 billion. But how could so much money rely on someone without any real financial background? That question became critical when tech stock values began falling rapidly this July. The fund held huge positions in hardware and energy companies, including SanDisk and Bloom Energy. When those specific stocks dropped, the fund lost vast sums of money in days. Major lenders and nervous investors quickly began placing intense pressure on the young founder. In a letter to clients, he admitted recent market drops had hurt the firm. Yet he urged them to invest more money before the start of August. Behind the scenes, prime brokers that lend money to hedge funds stepped in to force action. Several major trading firms rushed to inspect the portfolio and negotiate potential purchase deals. Wall Street titan Ken Griffin and his firm Citadel ultimately won the fierce 24-hour contest. Citadel bought roughly $16 billion of public stocks from the struggling fund. This emergency transaction ranks among the fastest and largest stock sales in financial history. The swift sale avoided broader market panic, but effectively stripped Aschenbrenner of his main portfolio. He's left managing only remaining private stakes, such as a position in Anthropic. Regulators are now raising alarms about opaque structures and excessive borrowing in private markets. The sudden collapse leaves investors asking how an untested founder received so much leverage so quickly. For our third topic today, we move from financial market shocks to a very unusual medical gamble. Montana has just finalized new rules that allow biotech companies to sell experimental drugs directly to consumers. Usually, unapproved medicines in the US are strictly controlled by federal regulators. Traditional right-to-try laws only allow desperate patients with terminal illnesses to test unproven treatments. Montana is expanding that access to almost anyone who can afford it. If a patient signs an informed consent form and pays, they can buy the drug. The law began with state lawmakers who wanted a stronger focus on preventive medicine. Soon, technology investors interested in radical life extension joined the effort. Similar experimental clinics have operated in private economic zones overseas. Now, proponents are trying to build that same fast-track model right inside the US. The bar for drug developers to enter this new market is surprisingly low. A company only needs preliminary safety data from as few as 10 healthy people. They pay an application fee of $12,500 to a review board. This board includes a local doctor, scientific experts, and an ethicist. Once this panel approves the application, the company sets its own price for the treatment. The state expects the first specialized treatment clinics to open near the end of this year. Supporters argue that individuals deserve the freedom to take calculated risks with their health. They promise that independent oversight will keep the process responsible and rigorous. However, health policy experts and academic scientists are deeply worried about potential dangers. Standard federal review exists to prove that a medicine is both safe and effective. Without federal oversight, consumers could pay huge sums for treatments that do not work. Even worse, patients could face serious and unexpected health risks from unverified chemicals. Critics point out that companies can now charge patients while collecting trial data on them. This turns paying customers into test subjects without the usual safety guarantees. Now, medical regulators across the country are watching this local experiment with intense interest. The central tension is whether Montana is speeding up medical progress or risking public safety. Moving on from experimental drugs in Montana, our fourth story takes us to global security. For years, NATO tried to expand its influence far beyond Europe and into Asia. Why is the world's largest military alliance suddenly pulling back to its home turf? Between 2019 and 2024, NATO steadily widened its focus. Leaders argued that European security and Asian security were deeply connected. They worried about China's rising power and its economic support for Russia. 2 years ago in Washington, NATO even called China a decisive enabler of Russia's war. They regularly invited leaders from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand to major summits. Now, that ambitious effort has quietly come to an end. At the recent summit in Ankara, China was not mentioned anywhere in the official declaration. It was also completely left out of the summit statement last year in The Hague. Years of careful diplomatic language simply vanished without any public explanation. The guest list from the latest summit tells the same story. 3 of NATO's 4 Pacific partners sent junior ministers instead of their head of government. South Korea sent its president, but the alliance chief met all 4 partners outside the main program. Their presence was reduced to a quiet side event. 2 main factors pushed NATO to change course so quickly. First, European members never truly agreed on treating China as a direct military threat. European governments signed past declarations to please Washington, but their primary concern remained defending Europe. Second, President Donald Trump has separated American strategy in Asia from the transatlantic alliance. The United States wants NATO to return strictly to its original Cold War mission. American defense officials describe this as a return to NATO 1.0. Even the diplomatic vocabulary of the alliance is shrinking. The broad term Indo-Pacific is now giving way to the simpler label Pacific. So where does this shift leave Asian partner nations? Countries like Japan and South Korea can no longer rely on a broad Western coalition. Instead, they must depend on smaller regional groups and their own direct ties with Washington. For Europe, the alliance is refocusing entirely on its own doorstep. The big question now is whether regional Asian coalitions can maintain stability without NATO beside them. Finally today, while NATO shifts its focus back to Europe, another crisis is worsening in the Gulf. Iran has launched intense airstrikes against oil facilities and civilian infrastructure in Kuwait. Storage tanks near key industrial areas have caught fire following these direct hits. This sudden wave of heavy bombardment has raised deep concern across global energy markets. Kuwait has long pursued a very cautious balancing act with its larger neighbours. It has maintained cordial relations with Tehran for many years. It also remains one of the strongest opponents of diplomatic ties with Israel. Yet its careful regional stance has not protected it from becoming a primary target. Iran claims its strikes only hit nations hosting American troops or partnering with Israel. Kuwait does host major US military bases on its territory. However, other Gulf nations host major American installations and have closer ties to Israel. Yet Tehran has targeted Kuwait far more aggressively since the recent ceasefire ended. Kuwait absorbed more than 1,100 attacks, second only to the United Arab Emirates. That huge discrepancy shows the official Iranian narrative is mostly a distraction. In fact, Gulf nations have absorbed over 80% of all Iranian strikes. Israel itself has received under 20% of those retaliatory attacks. The real explanation lies in strategic leverage and unique economic vulnerability. Kuwait relies entirely on the narrow Strait of Hormuz to export its crude oil. That sole reliance makes its energy infrastructure uniquely easy to threaten. Bombing hardened military bases repeatedly brings smaller returns as defenders strengthen positions. Striking oil storage tanks costs Tehran very little while creating maximum global pressure. It sends a sharp signal to Washington without risking direct war on primary American targets. It also reminds neighbouring states how fragile their energy facilities really are. This leaves global energy markets uncertain and energy importing nations on edge. Gulf leaders now face a difficult choice over how to protect their vital infrastructure. That brings our fifth and final topic to a close for this morning. Thank you for sharing your time with me over breakfast. I hope you have a calm and wonderful day ahead.